So for Lent, as I said, we've been exploring ways that we can change the world with individual spiritual practices, like daily choices that might actually have a real impact on creating a just world for all. But this week, I absolutely failed. I didn't decide which one I was going to do on Sunday, and I've learned that if I don't go into the week with a plan, it's really hard to actually do the thing that I say I want to do. As I drove all the way from a meeting in Los Gatos on Tuesday, I thought, well, I guess I can't be driving less this week because I've already kind of blown that. And then on Wednesday, as I bit into the most delicious prosciutto and brie panini, I realized it didn't make sense for this week to be the choose less meat option. And as I opened a large plastic Ziploc bag to put a leftover piece of pizza from the fridge, I thank God that I'd already crossed off the spiritual practice of using less plastic. Well, it's not really crossed off, it's ongoing, but the whole situation irritated me greatly because I like to tell a particular story about myself, and it is that I always follow through in what I say I will do. I am that person who does what she says she will do. But obviously this isn't true, right? Even our best stories can't be true all the time. And it got me thinking about the wide variety of stories we tell ourselves, both consciously and unconsciously. Stories that express what we value and what we don't, stories that set us apart, or stories that explain who we are. Now, I know my man's stories like the back of my hand, the ones that he tells his go-to stories, and we all have those, and the people who love us intimately know exactly what stories we tell. As Todd May writes, many of our stories about ourselves do this. We tell stories that make us seem adventurous or funny or strong. We tell stories that make our lives seem interesting. And we tell these stories not only to others, but also to ourselves. The audience for these stories, of course, affects the stories we tell. If we're trying to impress a date, we might tell a story that makes us seem interesting or witty or caring. Whereas if we're trying to justify a dubious act to someone who is judging us, or perhaps ourselves, we might tell a story that makes us out to be without other recourse in the situation. In the latter case, he goes on, what we are doing is dissociating ourselves from a value we might be associated with, and thus implicitly associating ourselves with a different one. Not all of our stories about ourselves express values like these. However, perhaps many and most of them do. This is so even where a story might seem to express a disvalue. Like we all know people whose stories about themselves are about how things don't work out for them. Anyone have a friend like that? Whatever they try, they fail, or the world conspires against them. These stories express values as well. Values that often stem from a resentment or despair. They buttress a view of the world that justifies their being who they are. Last month, I was sitting in a circle after a really long day of a great leadership training, but you know, when you get to the end of those things, you can't take any more in. And the whole point was devoting the day to uncovering our narratives and contexts, to kind of reveal as leaders what stories we really live by. I realized I had been continuing to tell a story that was no longer true. But it wasn't until I said it out loud to the group that I really felt it. And it wasn't until later that week. For a long time, I've been saying that I'm not a risk taker. Being a perfectionist creates conditions under which risks are generally to be avoided. But at the end of that week, as I reflected on what I had said, I realized that story was no longer true for me, and that it was time to tell a different story about myself. Amid the glorious green of the Pacific Northwest, there was also a lot of dead-end roads. And around middle school, it became clear that education would allow me to never find myself stuck at one of those dead ends. I was driven to succeed, and with that came a bit of fear about ruining my chances or messing up. I focused on doing it right and really not taking risks. It just made things easier. There was a lot I couldn't control, but that I could, and it got me far. And yet somewhere along the way, I had to take risks. In order to keep growing and going, I had to take a risk on a hope that where I was going to be would be worth it. And to get there, I was required to take a leap. Starting this community has been one of the biggest leaps of my life, asking me to draw deeper again and again when it wasn't clear how to keep going. I think of it as something like a spiritual artist when I never identified as that before. It has required more financial, emotional, and spiritual risks than I knew I had in me. Maybe this is what creators of any kind feel, as dancer Agnes DeMille put it perfectly. The artist never knows entirely. We guess. We may be wrong, but we take leap after leap in the dark. Surviving leaps in the dark and carrying on and taking risks and ending up here tells me it is time to tell a different story about myself. I am a risk taker. I am a risk taker for possibilities and justice and a greater love. I am a risk taker for beloved community. So tonight I want to ask all of you, what stories do you tell most often about your life? Are the ones you have been telling for a while still true? Or are the stories you tell opening a way for you? Or are they leading you to a dead end? The story we heard earlier of Jesus and the Samaritan woman stands out for me as among one of my favorites in the Christian text, in part because of its drama, but also because right now in my life I see it as an allegory about letting an old story die, so a new one can be lived. We see right away that Jesus crosses boundaries of all kinds: gender, ethnicity, religion. But this allows even a nameless woman to be seen and heard and known. Because she isn't given a name, we automatically know who has the power there, right? The story says right off the bat that she has less status and power. So we can start to read the many stories within the larger story about who has worth, about who has status and power, and then Jesus, like he does, flips it. Professor of New Testament Osvaldo Vina writes, as a Jewish male, Jesus is in a position of advantage over the woman. But as a thirsty and tired sojourner, he is obviously at a disadvantage, for he is a foreigner and doesn't have a bucket to draw water. After the woman's initial surprise, Jesus invites the dialogue of becoming vulnerable. Give me a drink. And by allowing the woman to exercise some power over him, because she is the one with the bucket. It seems like a sort of koan, where the metaphor for Jesus is living water, but he ends up thirsty himself. Right now, it seems to me that what Jesus really offers the Samaritan woman is the chance to tell a different story about herself. Because before this encounter at the well, the story that was her life was the story of being an outcast, or the woman with 5 husbands, or the woman alone at the well. But then she finds herself in deep philosophical conversation, and she is seen as worthy of rich engagement. Some commentators say that the fact that Jesus, a rabbi, disagreed with some of what the woman was saying is the best evidence we have that he was showing her deep respect. Apparently that's part of the tradition to sort of push back and challenge and question. After their exchange, the woman leaves to spread the word. And what stands out for me is one day she was living the story of an outcast, and the next day she's telling the story of what a boundary-crossing love can do. Professor Vina contends that the Samaritan woman legitimizes the discipleship of women by sharing what transpired to the surrounding areas. Maybe she awoke one morning later that week and thought, it is time for me to tell a different story about myself. Now the story she can tell is something different. I am not an outcast. I am a leader of a movement. Jesus creates healing for her by giving her the chance to tell a new story about herself. He says something like, right now, just as things are, just as you are, you can tell a different story. A story about yourself that will give life and love and hope to all who hurt. including you. Carl Jung, the psychologist, said that the reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories. Perhaps this is because we are made of our stories and we need them to be heard for us to be fully alive. And also maybe because pain can come from the stories that are old, stories we no longer want to live. So, beloved of God, what stories do you tell most often? Are the ones you've been telling for a while still true? Are the stories you tell opening a way, or do they lead you to a dead end? Right now, just as things are, just as you are, you can always tell a different story. May it be so. Amen.